Hello, I'm Mary Morrissey, and this screencast is to help you read medieval poetry more easily. I'll begin with the definition, what is Middle English, and then discuss how it differs from modern English in the ways it was spoken and the ways it was written down. Finally, there will be some hints on how to read Middle English poetry. First, a definition. Linguists use Middle English to refer to the period in the language's history between the Norman conquest of 1066, when English ceased to be the language of the ruling class and literary culture, and the invention of the printing press in 1476, when conventions about spelling began to standardise. Obviously, these dates are a bit arbitrary for discussing a complex phenomenon like a written and spoken language, but they do give us a useful rough guide. Some changes in the language continued throughout the early modern period, the period from 1476 until the end of the 17th century. There are some aspects of reading Middle English texts that are familiar to us today from reading Shakespeare, for example. There is still a distinction made between the formal second person, you, your, and the informal second person, thou, thee, thine, like the German du or French tu form. Conventions for spelling were not fully standardised, and people felt at liberty to spell that word with an IE or a Y at the end. Up until about 1700, the letters U and V were written down interchangeably, and the reader was trusted to know when the vowel U and when the consonant V was meant. The same is true of I and J. In some editions of medieval and Renaissance texts, editors will have modernised these aspects of the written language to help the reader, but you may come across editions that have not modernised the spelling in this way. There are other aspects of Middle English that make it less familiar than Renaissance English. There are some letters used in medieval texts that we don't see, for example, like the win, an older form of W that represents the W sound, or the yog, which represents the H sound. Although the basic grammatical structure of Middle English is the same as modern English, word order is subject, verb, object, there is far more variety in its vocabulary. This is partly to do with dialect. People wrote in their own dialects because there was no standard English. By 1500, however, the dialect of London and the South East had become the basis of what we consider standard English. Our dialect words are more rarely used in written texts. But in Middle English texts, you may come across them or hem for them, and you may see she and you may see hail. Why do modern editors not just modernise these things to help their readers? Well, sometimes they do, when they can. For editors of poetry, it is more difficult, because we think the spelling in medieval text was far more phonetic than our spelling. People spelled words as they sounded, and so the spelling is giving us important clues about the sound of the words, how they rhymed, where the stress in the word lay, and so about the metre and the rhythm of poetry. And from that we can gather that the words in Middle English, and so poetry written in the 13th and 14th centuries, probably did sound rather different. The sounds of the words in English changed dramatically in these centuries, and there are three main reasons for the differences. The first is in the use of the final E. The second is the great vowel shift, and the third is in the use of silent letters. First, final E. If you can remember back to your Key Stage 2 phonics lessons, you will remember silent E or magic E or bossy E. It was called so because it had an effect on the sound of the vowel before it, even though it was not itself pronounced. So we say pip and pipe. The same goes for cap and cape. The linguistic history of modern English's silent E is very complicated. The main thing to remember here is that the rule does not apply for texts written before 1500. In Middle English, an E at the end of the word doesn't have an effect on the vowel before it and was often pronounced. When the next word begins with a vowel, or with a H or a W, the final E is elided. Basically, it isn't pronounced separately because the sound of the two vowels runs together. Sometimes poets might leave the final E unpronounced to keep the rhythm of the line. By 1500, the final E is not usually pronounced. The Great Vowel Shift may sound like the title of a Doctor Who episode, but it actually refers to a dramatic change in the sound of the long vowels in English that took place between about 1400 and about 1550. There are many expert explanations of why and what and how this happened, but we don't need to go into those in great detail. The main thing to remember is that in Middle English, the long vowels are pronounced like this. The long A is usually pronounced A, so name. The long E is usually pronounced A, zwete. The long I is pronounced E, so wheat. The long O is pronounced O, schön. The long U is pronounced U, so fleur. There are other vowel sounds that historical linguists think may have changed. The best way to become familiar with them is to listen to recordings by modern scholars. There are links to some good examples on Blackboard. Silent letters. Writers of texts, scribes and poets in the Middle Ages did not need to abide by strict standardised rules of spelling, so they were more likely to write words down in ways that represented, as far as possible, their sound. So the word knicht was spelt with the hard C sound at the start. We have kept that spelling, but we no longer pronounce the hard C, so the problem is with us really and not with them. In general, medieval texts do not have silent letters. There are problems with the presentation of complicated sounds, like the GH, which in modern English is almost silent in words like though and night, but probably did have a sound in Middle English, a bit like the ch at the end of loch. Verb endings, ed or en, which we tend to say without the vowel sound, should be pronounced as a syllable, so pierced, not pierced, and warned, not warned. Editors can try to make a text consistent to one dialect, for example, changing heo to she, but only if that doesn't affect rhythm or metre. And we can try to regularise spelling so that the same word is spelt the same way, but there may be complications with this, especially with final E, for example, which is sometimes pronounced and sometimes elided. But editors can't always modernise spelling. Our night is not pronounced the same way that Chaucer's nicht was, and our night is not pronounced the same way he pronounced knicht. So here are our 5 top tips for reading a poem written before 1500. If a word looks unfamiliar, just try saying it aloud. Began might not look like began, but reading the line aloud will make you hear that the sound fits. Pronounce all the consonants in the word, even with words like knicht. And a Y at the start of a verb should be pronounced. It is an old prefix making a verb participle. Try to assume that the final E is pronounced, unless the word that follows it begin with vowel or H or W. Check the Oxford English Dictionary. It includes the most common Middle English spellings of many words in the etymology section of each entry. If that doesn't work, try the Middle English Dictionary, which you have access to online. And there are another couple of things to remember when reading Middle English. Firstly, a double negative does not make a positive. Instead, it was used for emphasis. So, ni non means not any. Middle English makes use of contractions. Pronouns and negatives are made part of a verb to form a single word. So, ni what means I do not know, and he nolde, he would not. I hope you find this helpful.